Welcome to everyone, especially this being the very last offering of the day. I really appreciate everyone being here and enduring sort of this last 90 minutes. Super excited about this panel. It's hard to believe that it's been over 10 years since BATA's 2012 Symposium, Releasing and Reforming Art Therapy as Social Action, and the Peace Paper Project keynote workshop and papermaking that we all did at Embassy Suites in Columbus, actually in the parking lot. So weird that it's been like a decade for that. So it's wonderful to be able to present at BATA again about the power of papermaking with this panel today. My name's Gretchen Miller, and I am going to be serving as moderator for the panel, which is papermaking as art therapy to address trauma and loss. The QR code that you see in the lower left corner of the slide links to a folder with papermaking resources and references from this panel, including there's a copy of the slide presentation and our reference list with links to that. I'm also going to show the QR code at the end as well, but I think somebody else explained it really nicely in a previous session. You just sort of point your camera on your phone to the code, and then a little link kind of starts to pop up, and then you just click that and it should go right to where you're at. But I also have the link to the folder too if you don't want to use the code. I can post that later. So all right, so here we go. So it is an absolute pleasure to moderate this panel today with this amazing group of art therapy papermakers and colleagues who I've experienced papermaking adventures with through teaching and workshops and events with the Peace Paper Project, an international community arts initiative that utilizes traditional papermaking as a form of trauma therapy, social engagement, and community activism. These are therapists. They're also part of a group of 20 authors who contributed to the forthcoming book, The Art and Art Therapy of Papermaking, Material, Methods, and Application, being released by Routledge in a little over 2 weeks. So it's been like a process of many years, but it's almost out there. And that book was co-edited by me and master papermaker as well as Peace Paper founder, Drew Lewin-Matat. So please welcome Annie McFarland. She is an art therapist, educator, and artist who works as an assistant professor of art therapy at West Virginia University in Morgantown, West Virginia, where she is joining us from today. Her current research focuses include trauma recovery, art making for health and wellness, and recycled papermaking. Dr. McFarland also has clinical experience in inpatient psychiatric centers, palliative and hospice care, and many also military populations. In the art and art therapy of papermaking, Dr. McFarland writes about her autoethnographic research that focused on pulping her late father's t-shirts and ties. Next, we have Meredith Lynn McMackin, who received MFA in studio art, MS in art therapy, and PhD in art education from Florida State University, where she researched the therapeutic process of hand paper making with student veterans. She works as an art therapist and licensed mental health counselor in Vancouver, Washington, where she is joining us today. Also from a hotel room, because I believe you're attending your high school reunion, right?
Yes.
As well. I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah, so thank you so much, yeah, for being here. Dr. McMackin authored chapter 6 for the art and art therapy of papermaking, entitled Voices of the Bereaved, Papermaking for Processing Grief and Loss. And then there is Denise R. Wolf, who is an art therapist, artist. She's an associate clinical professor at Drexel University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where she is today, and is the owner and practitioner of Mangata Services. Denise believes that a neurological understanding of trauma eliminates judgment and creates opportunities for community action care through therapeutic arts processes. Denise contributed Transformation in Papermaking When Content Mirrors Process to the Art and Art Therapy of Papermaking, sharing her experience as an art therapist and art therapy educator with hand papermaking through a trauma-informed lens. So thank you, panelists, for being here and your contributions to papermaking in art therapy. And thank you to all the attendees here to learn more about their experiences. So this panel format aims to be a conversational dialogue between the panelists, reflecting on a series of group questions I'm going to pose to them related to their implementation and experiences with hand papermaking, its methods and applications important to the therapeutic process, as well as trauma, grief, and loss. And so to help keep us on track with time, after about 15 minutes of the group kind of dialogue, I'm going to have a chime that sounds if I'm paying attention to things, just to let the panel know that there's about 5 minutes left remaining until we kind of move on to the next topic. And then there'll be like a final sort of chime when it's been like that 20 minutes. And we hope to have time at the end of the panel for a Q&A with the audience. So if you have any questions, you can post them in the chat box and we can address them during this time. So thank you. All right. All right, moving right along. All right, so I am going to start our clock after this on our first kind of question. So kind of throwing this out to the panel, the first topic and question is, what would you identify as a key therapeutic benefit of the papermaking process? And you can feel free to share an example or experience that helps elaborate on this finding. Maybe we can start with Meredith to kind of start the conversation off with your thoughts sort of about this question. And then the Denise and Annie can kind of jump in sort of with that. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think one of the things that is so wonderful about the process, and a lot of what I've done has been with groups with papermaking, is this kind of dual level that's happening. There's the physical experience, but there's also this emotional and mental process that's going on at the same time, which can sometimes, when you're dealing with past trauma or loss, there's a lot of intense emotions, but it's really nicely balanced with the physical and just being involved in that physical process. The diagram here is something from my dissertation research, working with a group of student veterans, and they actually pulped parts of their own uniforms. And so, and I just thought it was interesting how their emotional and mental process kind of went along with the physical breakdown and process of paper making. Because, you know, they start out with, they're cutting their uniforms, and that's where the sort of storytelling and bringing up memories and connecting with other people started happening. And then there's this, you know, deconstruction that's happening at the same time, and this idea of repurposing. And then they put their little pieces of their uniform in this machine, the Hollander beater, which is grinding it up. And, you know, you're watching the fibers release, and the softening that happens, and the cleansing that happens with the water. And then they're, you know, transforming that into a piece of paper. A lot of them had images that they did a silkscreen stencil with pulp printing, we call it, directly onto the paper when it's still freshly made. And it's, you know, it's that idea of repurposing and reconstituting something from the past to now it's got this new connection, this new group, this new, you know, they're at their university. And so it really went beautifully along with the process, the physical transformation of the paper making.
Thank you for, you know, linking, you know, the emotional and the physical parts together with the process. Yeah.
And I really think that it's, I mean, it makes it so accessible, and so that balance between, you know, because it's fun, you know, they're having fun at the same time, and fascination of watching this, you know, the fibers break down. And it just is a wonderful balance with what's maybe going on more internally.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Denise or Annie, in relationship to that, or in addition? Yeah.
Annie, I win. Okay, sorry. I was connecting to what Meredith talked about in terms of the value of both the content and the process, right? So like the content of like, what are you making the pulp from? Are you recycling paper from around the house or scrap paper? Is this an object, you know, that's near and dear to you from a deceased loved one or a military uniform? And so that's important, and the process is important as well. And they both kind of hold equal importance. And I think that tension or dialectic, right? These two sort of opposing ideas together is, you know, one of the key factors in paper making. Right, so in this slide, I'm talking about some of that content and process, these kind of this idea of other dialectics that are embedded in paper making. Paper is central to human experience, right? So it's something that's incredibly ordinary. We can look around where we're, you know, seated right now and see, you know, stacks and piles of paper. So in some ways it's very ordinary, and in hand paper making, it's also very extraordinary or extraordinary. So there's another dialectic of something really familiar and something incredibly unfamiliar. Hand paper making for most folks is pretty novel. And I think that brings a great value to you know, using hand paper making in therapy. And another dialectic is this idea of structure and chaos. Chaos might be a little far. Paper making is a sequential, structured process. So there's a lot of cognitive oh my gosh, a lot of cognition that goes along with it, and a lot of structure. And it's also incredibly kinesthetic sensory.
Like sloshing water and like pulling things. Yeah.
It's messy, and it's watery, and it gets everywhere. After a day of pulping, it's like I pulped some of my hair. It's in like my jewelry. It gets
weeks later. Yeah.
My arm hair has like a fine coating of paper.
Yeah.
And so those tensions, right, allow so much therapeutic benefit to be welcome into papermaking. So you have this rich sensory-based experience that's also highly structured. So participants can engage in that, I think, because of the structure. And there's some of the potential for dysregulation with all of that kinesthetic sensory experience gets kind of balanced out by the sequence and the structure, and there's movement, a whole body movement, from making the pulp to pulling the sheets to drying them and stacking them. So you are physically kind of going along with the process. Yeah, so there's containment within those processes as well. And you have an aesthetically pleasing product. What, sort of thinking about aesthetics from a neurological kind of idea of what we think of as beauty, right? At the end of this process, you have a thing, this external thing that other people will recognize, most likely, depending, is I created this, I did this. And it can stop there, or it can be activated further. Wow, I'm very excited about papermaking, obviously.
Yeah, it's nice that, Meredith talked about that bridge of the physical and emotional, and then you're like the leveling of the different sort of with the ETC and Bruce Perry's relational aspects and Judith Herman's different stages, and what happens with that. Yeah, so much going on. Yeah.
Right. So this is kind of how I make sense of this, right? All these feelings about papermaking and therapy. And I'll talk more about this as we move on through this panel, specifically, about applications in the treatment of trauma. But it was helpful for me to think about, okay, what are the sequential steps in papermaking? What parts of the ETC are activated, right now, with the ETC being, primary framework for understanding neurobiological implications of art therapy processes. Taking Bruce Perry's R's, some people say 5, 6, 7, but these sort of the qualities of engagement that are neural healing. And, going back to some of the foundational theories that Judith Herman presented around trauma, and seeing how that all lined up feels like magic.
Yeah, I really like your point about the structure, and helping to contain emotions. I know that because you have to follow that, and so there is some sort of safety in that.
Yep.
Yeah. Any thoughts?
I would agree with that too. I think the way that it's structured too, one of the things I was going to talk about was how this process, because of that structure, allows for autonomy and sense of kind of self-determination in terms of the level of engagement in the process, because especially if you have group members, you have people that are kind of maybe like, yeah, I want to jump in, I want to take this thing and make it into paper. They're really, in the process. And then you might have people in the group that are like, I don't know about tearing up a uniform. That seems scary. So they can watch, they can choose their own level of engagement based on the group setting. So I love kind of thinking about, as art therapists, we talk about, or therapists in general, meeting our clients where they're at. I think the sequence of this process allows for that safety and exploration, but also that sense of autonomy. And I guess I keep thinking self-determination, but that's maybe not the word I mean, but that choice, right? And it promotes like intuitive decision making. How do you feel about this? Do what you feel is right in terms of that process. The other thing too that's really, I think, is really unique, right? The group, especially if you're working in a group, that group dynamic is really powerful. But also too, with the individual, the selection of the item that they're using in the paper making process. In the case of using a Hollander beater, where you're using fabric, right? So for military veterans, a lot of times it's their uniform. But like when I did paper making with my dad's stuff, I had a garbage bag full of his t-shirts and all of his ties that he worked with, that he wore all the time. So I had all these items and stuff too. So it really allows you to kind of select and be really purposeful in what you're choosing. But I think also too, you might have people that I only have one uniform left, or I only have this one t-shirt or this one hat or whatever it might be of an individual that has passed away. So it allows them to decide, do I want to cut this up or not? And I was thinking about the experiences I had facilitating workshops. I actually went to Europe with Drew in the Peace Paper Project, and we worked with an individual in Scotland that she was in her 40s, I believe, but she still had the blanket that the hospital gave her when she suffered a stillborn birth, right? So it came in this cardboard box and was decorated, and she said, there's no way I can cut this blanket up. So I said, okay, you do not have to do anything you're not comfortable with. But a nice compromise was she was able to take the cardboard box and she pulped the box that it came in and was able to make paper out of that. So I think that kind of level of choice allows for creative decision making and really kind of tapping into that intuitive healing component that is really valuable here in this type of work with trauma and loss too. So.
Yeah, I agree. I often think of Judy Rubin's framework for freedom, when I first started working with Drew and trying to connect like how paper making fits, with like theory and not just like a fun thing kind of to do, with the media material, but really kind of conceptualizing it in a therapy way. And Judy's framework for freedom was something that really came to the forefront. And I feel like what you all are describing about the structuring, but then it's fluid enough that it's safe enough, and the different dichotomies with that. Yeah.
Also, I'm thinking just memories are coming back, but the first workshop we did with the Peace Paper Project at FSU, Florida State, and there was one fella that he was just going to watch. He came, he did not want to cut up his uniform, but the more he watched, he was like, on the video, he says, I really want to make paper.
Yeah.
And I don't know if he ended up using his own uniform or another uniform, but it really pulled him in, and he kind of got it after watching.
Yeah. I immediately thought of him when Annie brought up, like sometimes there's a hesitancy, and I particularly thought of that individual, as well as a paper making workshop where I actually met Meredith at George Mason, where it was another veteran that was in that workshop and was hearing kind of everything that was sort of being introduced, and was like, I don't know if I can do this. And it was really the emotional kind of aspect, and then kind of hung back a while, just to test it out, and just giving people the opportunity, whatever is most fit for them. I think we are at our 5 minutes.
Okay.
So I don't know if there's any additional kind of comments sort of around sort of this.
I think I was going to mention too, the really cool part of the way that Peace Paper structures their workshops is that you learn to share each other's pulp. Like people have different colors too. So in a way that's like a physical offer. You can use my pulp, but also like the metaphor of sharing your experience, sharing your items, sharing your resources in that group setting can be really powerful too as well. So I think there's a lot of metaphor in this process that is just really incredible when you see it happening too. So
I'm listening to you all talk. I was sharing, have similar experiences facilitating paper making. and thinking about the participants that come and observe for a while, right? And so really thinking about what that's about. So oh my gosh, old-timey theory by Kreitler and Kreitler, husband and wife team, probably from like the 60s, talked about sort of, not sort of, why viewing art helps us, why and how that helps us. And the general idea is that we bring diffuse tensions to, standing before this image or painting or sculpture, and through resolving the formal elements, there's a parallel internal process, and then we experience that sense of resolution. So thinking about people who enter into an intentional therapeutic paper-making space, are maybe first sort of impacted by what is even happening and how does this work? And so all of the sort of cognitive problem solving, instead of it being a, kind of intrusive thoughts or looping thoughts about a traumatic experience and the item that they might have brought to pulp, instead they're solving the question of what am I doing and how will I make paper from this? What's that crazy machine making all that noise? And so by sort of observing and resolving the question of what am I doing here, there's a resolution of some of the tensions, which in and of itself is therapeutic. And then, then they can enter into the actual art process.
Yeah.
So many levels. Yeah. Thank you all for sharing kind of your thoughts connected to this part of paper making. I think we can, move on to our next sort of topic for the panel, which is to share a method and an art application of paper making as art therapy. And how could that be implemented in a community-based or mental health setting? I think that's sometimes a challenge on the art therapy end, especially if you don't have a Hollander beater or safety issues, blender space, water. There's just like a lot of dynamics. And so I think sometimes our therapists are like, whoa, I don't even know if I can like do this. I know I've experienced that based on different settings that I have been in. So just curious about the panel's thought about that. And maybe we can begin with Denise's kind of thoughts on one of my favorite topics. Yes.
For sure, I would love to. So Gretchen and I have coined or are in the process of coining or are attached to this idea of radical paper making. We've actually just submitted an entry into the Encyclopedia of Radical Help on radical paper making. So that's pretty exciting. We've defined this as a process that embodies non-traditional media adaptations and material methods to paper making towards promoting paper making as accessible, collaborative, community-based, and socially engaged process. So traditionally, paper making belonged to the fine arts. And so when we talk about master paper maker, Drew Matat, right, there's a lot of skill and learning, and I don't mean to diminish that. In Western culture, we've really separated out fine arts from more social action arts or community-based arts. Michael Franklin calls this the Dick Blick style of art therapy. And so radical paper making says that is lovely and wonderful and highly respected. And we don't all have access to, $5,000 Hollander beaters to grind and pulp material. And people have been making paper without that for also centuries or time immeasurable. So how can we, or, what are the ways that we as our therapists bring paper making into communities and take away all of the sort of the levels of oh my gosh, fanciness, right? And oh my gosh, increase accessibility. And through that, there's a mirrored process of like there are alternative ways to connect for people who groups who've experienced oppression, racism, all sorts of oh my gosh, social ills. When the system is excluding you, is there a way over, under, through, or around, right? When the rules are designed to exclude you, maybe you don't follow the rules. And so radical paper making mirrors that, promoting it as in its accessibility. So this might, for some folks, it looks like using a blender that you might source at a local thrift shop, hand blenders. Sometimes folks can tear paper with their hands into just very small pieces and smash it around in water. I recently acquired what's called a mud mixer or a cement mixer, so it's basically like a very long, it looks like a very long hand mixer, that you'd make cookies with, but it's one and it goes into a driver. And so I am making pulp in my backyard in a 5-gallon bucket at 11 o'clock at night. And it's a little loud, but I've got great neighbors. And so what are the materials that are accessible in the space that you're in right now? And how can you bring these processes of paper making into your space without access or interest in these sort of more technical and cost prohibitive processes? And then that also pushes on social action art, right? What are we pulping? There's an organization in Philadelphia that works with folks who have been impacted by oh my gosh, systems of incarceration. And so some papers and documents, they invite people to come bring in legal papers and documents to pulp them. The paper itself can then be represented to the community as a way to increase awareness and engagement. So I will stop talking now, but that is one way that Gretchen and I are moving forward with this increased accessibility.
Yeah, so exciting. I mean, using blenders for paper making is totally not new, but I think the idea, of how it can be connected to implementing it realistically and practically, like within the different settings that we may be in. And I know Annie also has kind of some thoughts too around like that DIY kind of aspect.
Yeah. So when I was listening to Denise talk to it, Denise, I was like taking so many notes just from what you said. But I love everything that you're talking about, this idea of like radical paper making. And I don't know if, I'm sure you all have experienced this, especially if you've kind of made the transition from the fine art world to the art therapy world, that fine art world is not always the most approachable for people who are not artists, right? Or people that don't see themselves as artists. And I agree too. I think paper making has a long historical tradition. So there's this idea that it has to be done perfectly. And, I think when people come in, that's kind of what they think of. But this idea of radical paper making, like guerrilla paper making, like, nope, we're doing it with these receipts. We're using this. I'm using this $10 blender that I just got at the store, like, I think increasing that level of accessibility to this process is what's so amazing and in turn therapeutic for a lot of people, because they can take ownership of this process, especially if they've never made paper before. It can seem like a really intimidating process the first time you do it. And so to be able to use things that are more familiar, like you've probably used a blender, you've probably made a smoothie before, right? So you can figure out how to operate that. And also the idea of making your own molds and decals. In fine art, those things are so expensive to get formal ones, especially the larger formats. So to be able to go and you can even go to some place like the Dollar Tree and get frames, you know, and make your own molds and decals. If you have a blender, you have water, you have recycled paper, you have a bin, right? Like just a plastic Tupperware bin, you can make paper in your house too, and you don't need a lot of supplies. So I think this idea of using non-intimidating materials to create and use this process and really take ownership, and saying, yes, this is for me. It's not just for those people in the museum or those people in the art studio, right? I can do this too, you know? So I think that level of empowerment is really important in doing the DIY process like this. I do have a Hollander, but I have to say that the idea, I teach classes in the art therapy program, a materials class, and we do paper making, but I specifically chose to do this because I want the students to be able to replicate what they're doing in the classroom with future clients. But also too, even the students, some of them say, I don't know how to do this. Like, I don't know what I'm doing, right? There are even people that are artists or art therapy in training too. There's still a hesitation because it's a new kind of scary process. But I think this idea of breaking it down with that more accessible materials process, that is what the DIY part is fabulous for that too. So
thank you. Yeah. And I know it came up, I think, in the last topic, but that making meaning from the pulp, you know, whether it's what was pulped itself, you know, whether it was a specific garment or fabric that was meaningful, or maybe there isn't that. And I know Meredith sort of has some different things that you've done to kind of connect, to bring meaning kind of to the pulp when maybe the fabric or what's being pulped, there's no sort of connection to it with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, I mean, it is to transport the machine, although I know Drew takes it all over the world, but, you know, the Hollander beater, all of the equipment and all of the water that, you know, flies out of it. And it's not always conducive to being in a, you know, a therapy or an office building or wherever. And so what I have done a couple of times, and this is not my idea, but I have pre-pulped fabric, and this image is actually from that veteran workshop. So the fabric, there was already, you know, a real strong connection. But what I've done before is pulped fabric before a workshop. I did one recently where, and it was actually sort of personally meaningful because I pulped part of military uniforms, and then I pulped some VA hospital gowns that I had because I was getting ready to start a new job with the VA. And so I brought it to this workshop. And so in order for those folks participating to have a connection, I brought different colors of construction paper and just had them choose a color and write either an intention, or maybe they're thinking of someone, but they write a personal private message on that piece of paper. And then we put it in a blender, ground it up, and then added it to the pulp. And it actually makes really beautiful paper because you get all these little specks of color, and every once in a while you can see maybe a little bit of a word. And the first time that I participated in that process, this person pulled out, you know, the pulp on the mold and decal, and there was a big piece of blue paper there, and she said she had written something about her mother that had recently passed away. And so that was, you know, she made that connection. There was that personal identification with the materials that made it meaningful and personal for her. So that's a really simple thing to do. as well. But I have to say, Denise, I love the potato masher. I never thought of that. I mean, there are so many different ways to do it. Yeah, it's very cool.
Yeah, I wish I'd look to see, I bought a blend jet earlier this year, which is used to make smoothies. It's like a one shot kind of thing, and it helps create single sized pulping. You know, Denise and I did this at ATA last year. We did a 90-minute Fast and Furious workshop on radical paper making, and we had everybody use these like wooden embroidery hoops is like the most. Okay, she's got one there. And then we used like just screen, like plastic screen you buy on Amazon, and yeah, had everybody kind of pour, you know, versus pull. And it worked, you know, with that. So I kind of do that with my single serve blend jet with that. But it just makes a really possible, like in the settings. I know, like when Drew and I first started going to different programs or doing different workshops, and it would include like the Hollander, and everybody would experience it. It was awesome, and everybody would have so much fun. But then there would almost be this little like letdown. I could see like, how am I gonna like do this? Like I can't afford, you know, sort of this equipment, or I don't have the space. I work in a hospital, you know, and how can I do this? And there's definitely ways to adapt it in that way. So it's really inspiring to hear everybody's thoughts on that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So we have 5 more minutes if anybody wants to add anything.
Yeah,
Or
Gretchen,
Sure,
I was
sure.
going to mention, you were talking about adapting. So one thing I've done with my class that I started doing recycled paper making with is have them make a small number of sheets. And so they decide what they do with them, but I tell them make at least 3 and we're going to make journals with them. And so we use kind of thinking about activating the paper once it's made. I call them junk journals, but I hate that word because it makes them seem like they're not valuable. But combining handmade paper with other paper items, you know, it doesn't have to be all 100% handmade, you know, incorporating recycled items, receipts. I put like old lottery tickets in there, dictionary pages. So really kind of taking ownership again of, you know, this is what a journal looks like. It's clean pages and this, like, I'm going to make this however I want, and it's going to be mine and no one else's. So kind of that, how to claim it and to make it your own too. There's all sorts of ways you can use the paper itself for making art on top of drawing or collaging or painting, but also to making more of maybe a utilitarian, like a journal, something that I might use in the future too. So
yeah, thank you. That was a really good suggestion. Yeah. And the term, when we kind of say like activating the paper, that's sort of like doing something with the paper, making art with the paper, making a book, or, you know, doing some, versus it just being this like precious sheet of paper that you just like feel like, oh my gosh, I don't want to do anything with, or what am I going to do kind of next. Activating the papers like part is important to like the whole like process too, but it can be tricky to do. Yeah, thank you.
You can also cast the paper, right? Like you can pull a sheet and drape it over something and make a sculptural or 3-dimensional form. I have a little silicone ice tray that I put pulp into. Made little paper brains because they made brain ice cubes, and then I put battery operated lights in them. So there's I mean, we can get off the Decalin mold, right? Really push out on radical paper making and start to think about it 3-dimensionally as well.
Yeah, I know Drew's like done paper making on plastic masks like molds, which I know art therapists are into the mask making as well, but you can, put pulp over, or even your own face in pulping that. So yeah,
No.
gosh, so many good ideas. Thank you. Yeah.
Hey, Gretchen,
Yes.
what do you do with zippers and buttons and insignias and all that kind of stuff on a uniform or
Yeah.
a shirt or a pair of pants or something that somebody wants to cut up?
Yeah, I don't know if I mean I know the answer, but I don't know if anybody else wants to briefly kind of share that, because that's really important as well.
Yeah,
Um,
well, I mean, my experience is that we've kind of cut around seams and buttons and all those kinds of things. Just because pulping a seam that's multiple layers can be really difficult. But also they can incorporate, like the nameplates can be embedded into the paper. And so that's, or any kind of badges or whatever can become part of the paper as well.
Yeah, usually just giving like a Ziploc bag, so when people, if it's fabric and it's something, like a zipper or a badge or buttons, things that you couldn't pulp, you put those in the bag, and then you can, like Meredith was saying, incorporate that into when you activate the paper, or adding it when you're pulling. Even you can't put it through the blender, or the Hollander, but you could put it in the floating water and pull it up when you're pulling the sheet. So,
Or even after you've pressed the sheet down, you can lay it on there and kind of wiggle around the pulp a little bit to help it, adhere as well.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, so we are doing really good on time. So our third and sort of final kind of topic for the panelists is just telling us about a paper-making process or an example or approach that specifically could be considered by our therapists to explore trauma, grief, and loss. I know I revisited the reflections from your writing, just from the book that's coming out to connect to this topic. And for example, Annie noted, and I'm going to read sort of this, that the constant balance often discussed in art therapy, is it the process or the product which is most important? Through my autoethnographic research, I found value in both. The papermaking process was an emotional and sometimes triggering experience that must be approached with empathy and care. And in turn, the art product itself was representative of a transformative, moving, and poignant process towards healing and growth. The resulting product held so much more meaning than just a simple sheet of paper. This paper lives on, holding the memory of my father's life and his positive influence on those he touched. I don't know if Annie, if you've got any sort of thoughts sort of around, that whole process that you experienced, and then, documented it through video, right? And then wrote about it, and, all of that.
Yeah, so my story is, I've worked with papermaking since Drew came with Meredith in 2011, I think it was, maybe 2010 at Florida State University. And so since that time, I've been helping with facilitating workshops. I've been basically, our lives as art therapists and art educators is helping everyone else to make art. So in 2017, my dad is a Vietnam vet, and he got a glioblastoma. So he was diagnosed and died pretty quickly of a brain tumor. And so I never really processed that myself, but I knew when it came to, you know, when someone passes away, you have all their stuff. Like, what do I do with all this junk, right? We just tend to like keep everything. And I just ended up almost hoarding a lot of his clothes that my mom was going to give away. And I didn't know how I was going to use them. And then when the pandemic hit, obviously we're in quarantine. I had more time to think about things, and I just kept coming back to this bag of clothes that I had. And I applied for a grant through the university that I work at, and they gave me summer funding to buy some materials and to explore this process myself. So I documented through photos, through journals, and then videos as well, this process of cutting up his t-shirts and some of his ties. So for me, it was like a reflective process, you know, in terms of the empathy building, because as you do this process, I feel like I was so engaged in helping people with the logistical steps that sometimes you kind of get stuck like, okay, here's the first step. Now let me show you this. You know, we're very sequentially oriented that I forget about sometimes the emotions that are involved too. And so for me, cutting up his clothing, one thing that was really powerful was the sense of smell. For some reason, my sense of smell was triggered because the shirt smelled like him. Some of his ties smelled like cologne. It's like when you cut the fabric and you release that, it's like the aroma comes out too. And then I started thinking about too that at FSU, when we did the veterans workshop, we had one young man that was cutting up his naval uniform, and it had like he'd been on a ship, so it smelled like diesel fuel when he was cutting the fabric up. So it was really good reminder that this sensory, like all of your senses are activated in this process. And I think thinking about trauma, connecting senses, especially sense of smell, or any of those various or 5 senses connected to memory and experiences, how that can be triggering, but also very healing as well. And keeping you present. You're thinking about the past, thinking about something you've lost, but you're also in the present moment at the same time. So I went through that process of cutting up all of these things of my dad's. I made, I think, probably over 100 sheets of paper with his different ties and stuff. And if you use this process too, what I did was I pulped his white shirts for a long time, and then probably the last 10 minutes I put some of the tie stuff in, so that way you could still see the fibers before they broke down, so you can kind of play with it aesthetically as well. But one of the biggest challenges thinking about like the process and the product, and we've been talking about activating the paper, I still have a huge stack of paper that has nothing on it. I haven't done anything with it because I don't know what to do with it yet. And so that also too, just thinking about the product really made me think like, to ask someone, okay, I've just done this process of making this thing. It's like such a precious item. If you only have one sheet of paper, like just that idea of like the artistic mind and the criticism of like, I don't want to mess it up. If I mess it up, it's gone, it's ruined, you know? So like that perfectionist component too. So it was kind of like all these things wrapped up in my own experience too. So I would say too, if you are an art therapist wanting to do this process, if there's a way that you can use something that's personally significant to yourself, and it doesn't have to be related to a death or loss, you know, as significant as that, but just thinking about grief and loss of different varieties, try it yourself too, so that you can have that experience of seeing what it's like for you, and then in turn being able to work with other people too. So
thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I know, Meredith, you also use the papermaking process with grief and loss, and doing like a family workshop as well.
Right. Yeah. And I was just thinking about what Annie was saying, and it's so interesting how we've sort of paralleled ourselves, Annie. But I did a similar thing after my father died. Well, it was during COVID, and he died kind of at the beginning of COVID, and it was, before any kind of vaccinations, a scary time. Everybody was isolated. And so we did this workshop the next summer in our, garage and driveway, and invited family members, and we pulped a couple of my father's shirts. And so this is my younger son pulling a sheet, and it made this lovely blue color, because I mean, whatever you use is going to be kind of the color of the paper, and both of the shirts we pulped were variations of blue. And there was a beautiful thing written by one of my nephews that's in the book, and he talked about just how he remembered that shirt. It triggered a memory of a family dinner, and and holding hands, and my father used to say a blessing, and it just really triggered that memory for him, and it made it super special. But yeah, I agree with Annie. If you can have that experience of something personal, whether it's fabric or even papers. I love what Denise was saying about the sort of legal things, and being able to have that transformative experience. I also wanted to say, I was thinking about the idea of meaning reconstruction for processing grief and loss, and how this really works with the idea of transforming those memories into something new and a new experience. If you're in working with the family, it really brought the family together as well. And the idea of continuing bonds. This is a way you've got a piece of something related to my father, to the sort of the patriarch of the family, that keeps that connection there. It symbolizes that connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks. And Denise, we have 3 minutes before the 15 minutes, but we have 5 minutes on top of that. So yeah, I don't know if there's anything that you want to add connected to this.
For sure. Absolutely. Talking specifically about how papermaking connects to trauma, grief, and loss. So yeah, it's really just going to be sort of oh my gosh, different words to say the same things we've been saying all afternoon together. So the process being mirrored, right? That this idea of meaning making, there's a deconstruction and a reconstruction. So and it kind of, in my mind, mirrors the process of what we think about of the amelioration of symptoms of trauma, right? That there's an implicit meaning making that needs to happen. Who am I now that this thing has happened, and what is the world that I live in that can hold this event? And we don't get over trauma, we get through it. Right. And there's discomfort, and then there's reclamation or reforming. So looking, specifically in trauma work, and I talked about this in Gretchen and Drew's book, strengthening of resilience, or what Annie spoke about earlier as self-determination, through a tangible manifestation of change, right? No matter, tangible if paper or pulp is created, that you have this object that is a symbol for that process. Harriet Waiteson talks about that as one of the advantages of art therapy, right? This sort of like permanence and objectification. Meaning that you've created an object. Again, this process of transformative change, a letting go. And I've seen participants, I've had the opportunity to bear witness to participants breaking down. Wow, I was literally the materials that they brought, but maybe sort of more metaphorically, by engaging in that process, there is a letting go, and there's intentionally moving into that pain, right? Because pain can't be avoided in life. There's a sensory integration that happens, and all of that exposure to the pulp and the sounds and the smells. We are constantly taking in information through our whole bodies and through our senses. And there's a lot of neuroscience that says that, you know, as we take in sensory information and process it, that's you know, essentially brain regulating, and we're titrating to these experiences. I loved Annie's discussion of smell, and I kind of geeked out in my mind thinking about how the olfactory bulb in our brains, right, is situated right next to the hippocampus, which is essentially where memory is stored. So when you smell something and you're like, oh my God, that smells like my grandmother's third floor attic, right? Like that's what's happening. It's because those two parts of the brain are like almost touching. I know I'm trying to like speed up with
No, no
but yeah,
worries.
okay, maybe I can
Yeah.
breathe. Yeah.
Gosh, wow. Yeah, so many great things. And for Denise's, when I was revisiting that, there was a quote of, and you've mentioned this, like papermaking is a mirrored process of destruction and reformation. It culminates in an externalized and often aesthetically pleasing product that has new meaning and purpose. Essential in papermaking lies a scaffold in iterative process well suited to treat trauma. I think that's like really, really important, connecting those. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks. Yep.
Oh,
And so
yeah.
the slide Gretchen has up is different words to say again the same thing, aligned to the work of Dr. Bruce Perry.
Great. Yeah. All right. Thank you all for your thoughts sort of on these different topics. And now we're able to open just to do a Q&A.